Beautiful. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody, and good evening. Welcome to our session today, and we appreciate your time. At MBM, we're all about being informed and present. So, welcome to our webinar where it's two people at the same struggle. So, I'll start with a prayer and we'll start this webinar. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. Alhamdulillah, indeed all praise is due to Allah. We praise Him and seek His help and forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evil of our souls and our wrongdoings. He whom Allah guides, none can misguide, and he whom Allah leaves to go astray, none can guide. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. I bear witness that there is no God except Allah, alone without any partners, and I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his servant and messenger. With that being said, I would like to introduce our host today and our presenters, Uncle Andrew Gardiner, a proud descendant of the Wurundjeri clan of the Woi Wurrung people and a Muslim revert. Uncle Andrew has been a part of numerous boards and committee working in the service of Aboriginal communities. And we have Dr. Umba Rind present with us, a GP with a passion for social justice and community health advocate, with a proud Camellia and Yamaji Badiami ancestry. And Uncle Andrew, if you could help us with the acknowledgement of country.
Good. Well, Assalamu alaikum. I'll start off doing a welcome to country because acknowledgement is from somebody else other than a traditional owner, as I am a traditional owner of the Wurundjeri clans, the Wurrung people. I'll do that. So I'm a Assalamu alaikum. I'm a Wurundjeri man, elder of the Wurrung speaking people, identify as an Aboriginal Muslim Australian. So it's a pleasure for me to be on this webinar this evening. I'd like to acknowledge my ancestors and our families in our traditional country. I'd also like to acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be on tonight, including Dr. Umba, acknowledging her ancestors, families, and traditional country. I'd like to acknowledge all other people that are attending the webinar this evening, including the people running the webinar. For Aboriginal people, our cultural heritage gives meaning to our lives. It identifies who we are, our connections, and now into the future. People hear the term traditional owner. Aboriginal people identify this as owning our culture, our heritage, our language, and our ceremonies. We still practice many of these today. We know our family connections and relationship to our traditional country. We have never ceded our sovereign rights. For our mob, there were 6 clan groups of the Wurrung that we had an oral history passed down from generation to generation for thousands of years. We believe in what our ancestors and elders tell us as being the truth, because we did not have a written history. So everything was shared around a campfire by men and women, elders who had extraordinary memories, who could recall things and pass them on without changing them, only unless there was a significant event in which they would add that into the stories. So one of the stories was our traditional country. Our traditional country is from the mouth of the Werribee River on our western border, north along its flows to the headwater in the Great Dividing Range, and then easterly across to Mount Borbor, and south through Bunyip, and westerly across to Moriela Creek. Our ancestors were custodians of land and waterways, as we are today. And I recognise our country is like our mother, cares for us. It gives us resources like food and shelter and things such as that to maintain life. These were provided to our ancestors for thousands of years. We took only what we needed and we moved on to another area within our clan homeland. So as not to overuse a resource. For more than 65,000 years, we've occupied this landscape. We're one of the longest living continuous cultures in the world, something that must be acknowledged and appreciated, as we add value to the rich tapestry of cultures and life in this state, in the city of Nam, Melbourne. From the tips of the leaves of the trees to the roots in the ground, we share our country with you today. We share our country with you today. We acknowledge the traditional country in which we gather this evening and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, as they are our knowledge holders, our cultural authority and our wisdom givers. For everybody here this evening, I say Woman Jika. Woman Jika is welcome in a general term. So Woman Jika Yemen Kundi Bik Wurundjeri Wurrung Balak means welcome to the traditional country of the Wurundjeri clans, the Wurrung people. Nungojin means thank you. So you can, that's it.
Thank you for that, Uncle. So, Dr. Umar, would you like 2 minutes just to give the group a brief introduction of yourself before we start? Are you trying to unmute yourself?
Yeah, it was the host was only able to unmute. So, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And it's a real honor to be a guest, especially with someone like Uncle Andrew. So I feel very blessed and honored to be asked to participate. So my background is quite complex. So I am a Cameleer descendant. So my great grandfather came here in the the early 1890s, and married an Aboriginal woman. And she was from the Badamai Yamaji area, which is Geraldton. And for those not familiar, it's more south of Western Australia. So we've had quite a long and interesting connection to this land. Work-wise, I work as a GP, and I do community health advocacy and things like that. And recently I've been asked to do a few talks on the similarities between the Palestinian struggle and the First Nations struggle. Yeah, so that's kind of a little bit about me.
I like how you sum it up with that's just a little bit about me. But that's actually a good point you brought up, sister, because I'll be honest, I'm speaking for myself and not for anybody else. I've been in Australia for almost 20 years now, but for the first 16 years of my life, I was not really exposed to much of the indigenous culture or many Aboriginals, to be very honest with you, because, I I studied in Melbourne, went to uni, did the whole normal stuff every immigrants would do. And then 4 years ago, Allah blessed me with the opportunity of moving to Alice Springs. And that's smack bang in the McDonald regions. And I traveled across the vast, across central Australia, Warburton and Nangajara lands to Kalka and Mimley in APY lands, and all the way down to Kalgoorlie and the McDonald regions, all the way to the top end. And I was struck by what I saw because I found people able to smile and they were just happy with their situation, and they seemed to um, accept where they were. But you can see there's a lot of systemic barriers that they face. And I'll put my first question to yourself, Uncle. Traveling all that region, why is there hardly any Aboriginal presence in the most fertile lands in the country? Like, where are they? Like, if I didn't go somewhere remote, I would not have, like, if I didn't bump into Yundamu, I would not have known people were there in that remote part of this country.
I'll just add a little bit more interesting connection with my background and my family, and then I'll go on to answer that. My kid's mum is from Mount Barker in WA, and of course she's a Noongar. So my kids have got Noongar in them. So they got Eads and Williams and Punches. But they also have some Khans from Kalgoorlie, which you just mentioned, made me think of it. So there's got a little bit of Afghan Cameleer in there too, so man. So my kid's auntie is Sandra Eads. You might know her. She's a professor at Melbourne Uni.
Inshallah,
Used to
one
be a
day I'll get to
GP.
know her.
Anyways, so she was one of the first Aboriginal graduates from WA to become a practicing GP on the eastern coast. So to answer your question, it's fairly simple. It's complex, but it's a fairly simple answer. Why aren't there any Aboriginal Indigenous people on the eastern seaboard? Well, because our ancestors were exterminated pretty much by white squatters and settlers who pushed them off their land and assumed those lands were assumed by the British Empire and the Crown from the 1800s. Well, earlier than that for Port Jackson, but talking about Victoria and Melbourne, our mob. Particularly the invading British saw Australian shores. There's a lot of there's many stories about how they had seen a lot of commonality with the with how they recalled British countryside. A lot of similarities, different trees and stuff, but they saw open plains and treed areas as well as forests and such. So they saw a lot of opportunity in grazing land for cattle and stuff. This land had never had hard-hoofed animals on it, so it wasn't suited for them. When they introduced the cattle and sheep, it actually decimated a lot of our already existing plantations, if you like, because we planted a lot of yam daisies, which was a root, a bit like a sweet potato, a bit smaller, but we'd use that and grind that up, make our flour, right? So these things were decimated by the introduced animals because they eat the tops and root up the ground and stomp all over them because they're heavier animal, and so it actually created a lot of destruction for our traditional food sources. That being the case, that assisted to drive us away from our traditional country as well, as people became malnourished because they couldn't hunt and gather their traditional food sources, and hearing loud, thunderous noises that they'd never heard before. It was quite scary for them, I would imagine. They'd never seen guns and things like that before. So when those people were being shot at and stuff, then a lot of people just ran.
Like, I'm just trying to imagine what it would have been like, because you're seeing strangers step onto your shows, and it also for some reason it reminds me of the Palestinians where they can't harvest their own olive trees, and the way they're being treated in
See,
terms of
Aboriginal people originally Aboriginal people saw these white fellas getting off of boats. No, they were the first boat people to Australia, by the way. uh, when they saw them getting off, because they were very fair, pale, white skinned, they imagined them to be somewhat ghostly. It was a different. I've talked to a number of people Yolngu people in Northern Australia, whose historical reference with the Macassan fishermen, and that was an Islamic visitation. They saw brown-skinned people, so they associated with them. They didn't know them, but they weren't scared of them either, and they were able to communicate through some sign language. And after a while, they shared food and got to know each other, practiced their language and helped communicate. And so they kept coming back for hundreds of years. They first visited our northern shores in the late 1500s, so well before Cook. Yeah. So if we look at post-Cook, then a lot of the British who were coming to our shores here and in New South Wales, what's known as New South Wales now, people didn't see them naturally as I guess humans or men. They call it this. They would have thought them to be different. They didn't aggressively attack them, but they were very suspicious, let's say. So it took them some time to actually enable some people to get to know them. They used interpreters from other states, some other areas, who really couldn't translate that well because they didn't know our language that well. So some rough sign languages sort of got by, but because those interpreters were other Aboriginal people from other areas, they kind of had a more trusting relationship with. The other people that they were communicating for, they didn't.
That's a good. So basically, Uncle, what happened is, you had all of these basically strangers, come into this country, introduce the cattle, the livestock, and it basically is taken a, you were mentioned about the rootstock, which, the flour which they grind to make flour. So all of you're talking about the whole ecosystem that just got destroyed. And I'll put a question to Dr. Umba here. In terms of the mortality, so I was looking at his documentary which talked about the diseases which were introduced, like, measles, chickenpox, things that the indigenous immune system had never faced before. Like, what kind of impact did that have on the indigenous community at the first interactions and over history also?
So remember the populations in this country, so the First Nations people had never been introduced to a lot of the diseases that were brought. So the main ones were smallpox. There were major epidemics that broke out. And in some instances, up to 50 to 70% of the people, of the Aboriginal people exposed were infected. So you can imagine the toll that would take. So there would be mass deaths. There's also deliberate colonial practices of giving blankets that with smallpox or that have been on ill people, and then deliberately giving them to Aboriginal people. And there's cases in, and this is all, you can find this in Trove. I love reading through Trove, that where there were so many Aboriginal people dying from smallpox that there's areas in New South Wales where there was bodies just floating in the rivers. Like there was that many people dying. And I think Uncle Andrew has summed it up completely well. It was the policies of colonial displacement, the idea of terra nullius, that nobody, no one was here. So the other diseases I can talk, there was influenza, measles, there would have been chickenpox, also sexually transmitted diseases, which people often forget. So the sexual violence perpetrated against Aboriginal women and children, that led to also deaths as well. So, and the other thing I wanted to mention too was the violence, just the straight out frontier violence of settlers killing, shooting, and outright just decimating populations and families, and also forced displacement. So moving people from one area of the country they were in to another where they were not familiar with, and then separating families, people losing contact and language and connection. So that's some of the reasons.
And that's scary enough, even it being a few. And I did not think about the finding out about the blankets being this. It's like something you write in a movie.
Oh, there's lots of stories. Yeah.
Some sick director wants
Oh.
to, how do I make this scene more grotesque? But
Oh, they used to put arsenic in bread and give it to Aboriginal and First Nations people. Poison.
Yeah, they
Subhanallah.
put it in the flour.
Yeah.
They poison the flour to get you given in. Yeah, so
Subhanallah.
before occupation, there was an estimated 100,000 people in the space we call Victoria now. 100,000 people. 2 waves of smallpox, which came down the eastern seaboard, across Gunnar Kurnow country, which is East Gippsland, through Woiwurrung country and across into what's known as South Australia now. 100,000 people from one border to the other, pretty much. And when that was early 1800s, 2 waves, and there might have been more, but those 2 waves I know I've read about. But by the time the 1860s came around and our people were being pushed onto missions, that's only 60 years, let's say, there was only about an estimated 5,000 people that went on to missions around Victoria. There's something like 15 or 20 missions were established. So it's astonishing to actually realise the amount of impact that had. Now, that was the smallpox, a number of other diseases, but that also included, poisoned water and flour that was given, massacres, 22 registered massacre sites in Victoria, only 22. There were many others.
When you say, do you have, sorry, Dr. Mo, you were going to say something?
No, I was going to say overall, I think there have been 270 massacres, like Australia-wide, that have been documented, and that's between 1788 and 1930. And yeah, there's lots of information on, and in Victoria, I think that's something we need to be aware of, that we drive past these places all the time.
Sure.
Reason some
Absolutely.
places are named, I think Uncle Andrew will know more than me, but Skull Creek and these things, they're named this because they would kill First Nations people and behead them and then put their heads on sticks and things and poles along the creek. That's why it became known as Skull Creek. So
It's a
stories
bit
like
like
that.
the intimidation, isn't it? It's like psychological warfare, but without bombs and landmines.
But apparently
And
they were bringing civilization. That was civilization.
but that's always the excuse of the colonizer, right? Because it's how else do you justify what's being done? And you mentioned oral history, Uncle, because about the stories, people, saving the stories, and once when something cataclysmic happened, they make sure that it's mentioned in the story. Like one thing that interests me is I've never understood generational trauma. And having worked with a lot of young men, having worked with a lot of the indigenous community, it's something that's always brought up with me. But I've never felt comfortable enough to say, what is this generational trauma? Like, help me understand so I can better, just be a better neighbor or just a better person to help out.
Well, if we look at the stolen generation as a very specific example of that generational trauma, forced child removal, middle of the night, a person's hut or house front door was kicked in, police would enter the house, take the kids screaming out of the bed, take them outside, put them into the car and drive away. This happened many, 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 many times across Victoria. For women, I always ask in crowds, the ladies who are mums, put their hand up so I can talk to you personally. And that is, how would you feel hearing that and that actually happening to you? What would you think? How would you feel? Somebody taking your kid in the middle of the night, or kids, you would feel devastated. You'd feel, why did you do that? What have I done to cause that? In a lot of cases, it was designed to break down families. In a lot of cases, it was just inappropriate thinking that Aboriginal people couldn't look after their kids. They're probably better, managers of children over thousands of years in our own, in our own backyards, our environment, being part of the natural resource managers of this land. So that's a prime example, because if a kid got taken away and never to see him again, got put into orphanages, treated extremely badly, the girls usually were trained as domestic servants for white families. Well, the boys were trained to be farm hands for white farmers or squatters who became settlers, let's say. People become very disjointed and untrusting, or what happened to me? Where's my mum? As they're growing up, all that starts to vanish. But they have this feeling about wanting to find them, but they never do, because they've either been moved interstate or the parents have died or whatever. We've heard many stories through the Rook Justice Commission hearings of these kinds of stories, and this is evident in the movie Rabbit Proof Fence. So I encourage people to have a look at that, because that's a prime example about how kids were taken away, moved off to an orphanage, and in the movie those kids try to find their way back. Now they had to make their way back over hundreds of miles on foot, and you know, it just goes towards some of that basic training kids had when they were little, that they could remember their way back, counting the stars and going where the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So they kind of had an idea about where they had to head back to. So, you know, I don't know if I'll put the slides up, because I think we're sort of just answering each question, is it? Or you want me to go
It's
through
okay,
that?
Uncle. No, no, no. We can put it up in a bit. Brother Imrul, if you could get the slides ready. And, you know, you were mentioning a lot of points over there, Uncle Andrew. So, you know, 'cause at Muslim Boards Matter, we're all about being informed. So I mean, speaking just for myself here, there's not a lot of information I know. The history that I learn is not the history that, you know, the history you're talking about is not something that's covered in mainstream sources. Unless I speak to someone like you know, it's not something people would get exposed to. So as Muslims, just as decent human beings, not being Australians, like, why should we care about, you know, Indigenous rights and the future of the Indigenous people in this country?
Oh, well, being good Muslims, you should always consider standing up for injustice and seeking to support people who are being oppressed and persecuted in their own country. As you can see on the screen there, these are the different tribal groups, language groups across the state of Victoria, what's known now. And you can see the breadth of the difference. You can see in the middle, just above where Melbourne is, Port Phillip Bay, you can see just to the west of that is Wathaurong. And then there's the Woiwurrung, the Bunurong, the Tongarong, and the Dja and the Norrang. The Wurrung is a language suffix, so that means there's a common language. They've got their languages are separate, but there's a lot of similarities. So there'd be dialect difference, if you like, but that's known as the Central Kulin. So when you hear, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation or the Bunurong of the Kulin Nation, that's what that refers to. We're only the Kulin Nation when those 5 or 6 tribal groups come together in ceremony. Otherwise, they separate tribal groups. But you can just see how interactive that is from one side, Bidwell in the far east, to the Bowen on the far western side, goes into South Australia. You can see how the breadth of that is so clustered in different groups, and those tribal groups along the northern border, which is the Murray River between New South Wales and Victoria, those border tribal groups actually went over the river into New South Wales. So it wasn't just these weren't just bordered by the river; they actually went over into New South Wales as well.
I'll pose the same question to you. Like, what would you say to just any Australian or Muslim or whoever, just another human being, in terms of you know, Indigenous rights and what the future looks like for us to coexist? Like, what would you want them to consider? Like, how would you educate us?
Sorry, I
Oh,
missed it.
this
Were
is
you
today?
addressing that to
Yeah.
me?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Right. Okay.
I was addressing you, sister.
Sorry, I don't know if it's my connection or. Oh, yes. So how would I speak to a person about addressing these? Well, it's the foundations of this country. It's founded in genocide and massacres and mass removals of the original inhabitants of the land. If you want a cohesive society, you need to come to terms with your past as well. So, and I think Australia is very far away, a lot of Australians, from even close to understanding that. There's still a high number of, like, it's a high percentage of racism, ignorance, stereotyping of First Nations peoples. So I think just understanding the history, because that what has happened in the past does impact those still in the present. I've had patients only a couple of years ago who are stolen gen patients suffering from trauma, mental health problems, physical health problems because they chose certain lifestyles due to trauma. So that can be drug addiction, that can be alcohol, things like that. And I remember one of my patients' story where she'd only met her brother when she was in her. So she was from stolen gen, so she had two or three brothers and a sister, and they were all separated, so they never got to grow up together. So they only met each other in their 30s and 40s. And then after first meeting her brother, he was unwell. Within a year or two, he passed away. So you can imagine that trauma over time. I think we as human beings, we need to acknowledge that if we want to build a cohesive society, and if we're going to ignore it, it's never going to work.
Because it's too much resentment, nothing good comes out of it. That when you were speaking about that a lady who didn't see her siblings till she was around 30 years, it for some reason it reminded me of a 5-year-old who was arrested in West Bank and forcibly removed. So I'll ask this to you, Uncle, and also Sister, if you can also give us your opinion on it. When you see what's happening in Palestine at the moment, and when you see the way those people are being treated, like, how does that resonate with you? How do you see history repeating itself, or do you see it happening on an industrial scale? Like, what emotions does it move in both of you? I'll start with you, Uncle.
Well, it affects me greatly because it's history repeating itself in a lot of ways, because our people have already been through that. The same perpetrators, the British, are the same perpetrators in this. They were the ones who formulated the breakup of the Middle East. So they purposely set about how to break that up. And who was driving that? We'll find out down the track. But at the end of the day, the British Empire, wherever they've gone, they've taken from the place the resources and used it for themselves, not caring and treating the original inhabitants, not just Aboriginal people, but I'm talking about India and a lot of other countries around the world, where they've actually come in and taken over, pulled all the resources out, and then sort of moved on to somewhere else. This is the same practice. Australia, our continent was just used as a way of getting people out of the British prisons in England because they were getting too full. They didn't have where else to put them. So people were sent off to circumnavigate to find a place where we could go and throw them away. And in doing so, nobody was watching them, so they sought to just take over and do whatever they like. There wasn't much rule of law other than whoever was commanding the different operations. So, you talk about various treaties, and particularly the most recent one with John Batman, 1835, most recent one here in Australia. But, it was just not long after that, around the same time, that the Treaty of Waitangi was being negotiated with the Maori chieftains in New Zealand. Why did they get a treaty and we didn't? We got Batman's treaty, but his treaty was just, it was a deceitful agreement that he sought to get personal advantage out of. Quite clearly, he wanted to be the first property developer, because I've seen the document. It's actually on display at the moment at the State Library of Victoria. It's called the Treaty Exhibition. And you can go and have a look at that document. And it actually says it's all written out in his personal interest. He had people sign them. No, he didn't, because those men never used a pen before. They never went to a mainstream British school, so they wouldn't have been able to use the pen to write their name. There's a couple of little scrawlings on the right-hand side, but there's a lot of academics have actually notated that he probably did that himself for them, because no historical reference through any of that information about the Batman Treaty signing and those people that were there. There's no reference to individuals having confirmed they signed that. So we believe that he did that himself. Now, why do I conclude that? I conclude that because there's previous information that goes to his state of mind, the type of personality that he was. Yeah. He was born and grew up in Sydney and Port Jackson. And then he went to Palawa country, which is now Tasmania. And he sought to be a land grabber. And he had to kill a lot of Aboriginal people there, a lot of Palawa, to take over that country. And then obviously the Neon sold it. So he grabbed what he could. This is in his early 20s, by the way. And then there's actually a record of an artist painting him in a portrait in a scene of particularly what was supposed to be his property. And the painter was interviewed. I think his surname was Grover or Groves. He was interviewed after that, and he was asked what did he think, what kind of person he thought that Batman was, and he used a couple of expletives, but two of the key things was that he was a cheat and a liar. Now, that's the type of attitude that he had, the personality that he had to write this document up. And then when he went back to see Governor Burke in Port Jackson, he cancelled, because he said to him that's not what he sent him there to do, not to make a contract in his own right. But see, he actually did two. He did one for the Wurundjeri people, and he did one for the Wathaurong people in Geelong, because when he first landed, he landed in the Bellarine Peninsula and he moved around towards where Melbourne is now. So yeah, he purposefully set about trying to do a land grab himself here, because he had a fair idea that the governor on behalf of the Crown was going to assume some land and actually then start selling it to people, because he was one of the first 29 men to buy land between the Plenty River and the Werribee River. 29 British men, 2 years, bought all those tracts of land. Yeah, he
Reminds me
died
of
at
how
36.
people in
He died at
like
36
mm,
of syphilis. So it just goes towards he was a cheat and a liar and a deceptive personality the whole time.
like one thing when you mentioned, Uncle, the first property developer, they're actually selling plots of land at the moment in Gaza, in in the US, and it's just people assuming that they can just, like, whose land is it for you to sell it,
Sure,
right?
exactly.
How about yourself, sister? If you can share us with your thoughts.
Yeah, my thoughts, the similarity is both kind of involve external powers claiming the land of Indigenous peoples. And just tell me, I don't know if my connection is bad or it's yours, so let me know if there's any problem.
Can hear you
The
loud and
use
clear.
of military force.
Mm.
Yeah, so the use of military force is the biggest the comparison. And I'm sure had they had the technology in the early, when the settlers, the British, arrived here, I'm sure they would have used it the same way it's being used in Gaza now, if they had access to AI and drones and things like that. The kind of carnage that they were able to do just with their guns and with their simple things here, I think it would have been on a mass scale like it's happening in Gaza. I think the other thing we need to remember is both in Australia and in Palestine, there's two separate legal systems. So one for the colonizer and one for the occupied population. So Aboriginal people, there was rules for First Nations peoples that were different. I mean, even recently there was a Northern Territory intervention, like for a particular group of people. Like, how racist is that? It's not like that has changed. So the fact laws are applied differently. Even now, I mean, this 30% of the prison population is Indigenous in this country. So there's something going on wrong with the legal system that this is happening. The other thing is restriction of movement. So putting Indigenous peoples in like they had the what are they called, those the schools, the stolen gen, relocating people so they lost their language and culture, suppressing their language, forcing cultural assimilation. So by stealing the children, who I should mention, a lot of people don't realize a lot of children were sexually abused in those schools and those settlements. And then, and I remember seeing a video recently of an Indigenous person who was, this is, I think, Canada, they speak Cree, is that, I could be wrong, how he was not allowed to speak his language. So he was taken, imagine as like a 6-year-old, and that's the only language you know. And then every time you open your mouth and you spoke that language, you were hit, smacked until you learned that language. And I'm sure they did it to the Indigenous kids here, where you would be smacked, slapped in the face, hit, punished for speaking your native tongue until you learn English. So there's so many comparisons, I think, and the fact that they're still struggling to recognize the Palestinian rights and First Nations here. There are a lot of similarities. Obviously, there's huge historical differences, but yeah, a lot of similarities.
Sharing that, sister, because you being a GP, and we've talked about diseases, we've talked about how it was spread, the poisoning that happened. In terms of the medical care that the Indigenous, is there any records of medicines being, like, did you guys have hospitals? Were they treated? Where were the sick treated? The Indigenous people, when they fell sick, if you're looking in the past, what support did they get from those who came to this country? Like, what means were made available for them to access it?
I haven't researched that aspect, but I pretty sure they would have gotten nothing. So they would have been just left to die on the outskirts of the towns. They wouldn't be allowed into the settlements anyway, because you weren't allowed to go in there because they were not white. So you would be left to die. I don't think there may have been some help they got, but I don't, yeah, that's something I'd have to research to give you a proper answer. But there's cases of people just left to die. I mean, bodies floating in rivers and things, so that means that they didn't get any help.
For the banana question, I'll ask you. So, Uncle, just so we understand, because we're talking about colonization a lot, we're talking about settlers coming to this country, people just assuming that this land is theirs, there's a God-given right for it to be theirs. What is the difference between immigration and colonization?
Well, that's an interesting question because they're starkly different. The immigration, well, that's a control system with checks and balances, passports and visas and whatnot. Yeah, it was colonization is just takeover by force or otherwise with suppression as a divide and conquer process, which is the end game. So colonization's taking over, moving in and pushing everybody out, saying, now we're taking over, we're assumed this for the Crown, using now under our law, as opposed to immigration, which is a system. So, for example, the Batman Treaty, which I spoke about earlier, our elders, our ancestors who heard him talk to them about what he wanted to use, he provided them all these hatchets and flour and tea and coffee and blankets and what. They would have looked at them and gone, yeah, okay, so what's that brown smelly thing? A blanket. Who knows what has been on it? But they already had their own possum skin cloaks to keep them warm. They didn't need these blankets. Hatchets. They already made their own stone axes, so that was one of their main trading sources. That was like gold for them. Yeah. Other things like yam days, we already cultivated our own crops of those. There's a whole range of things that they would have looked at those implements or those offerings and gone, yeah, I don't know. I think this guy just wants to stay here for a little bit and go back home. They understood a Tandarum ceremony. A Tandarum ceremony was a temporary use of the land ceremony. We were very obliging. Our people back then were very obliging. If somebody didn't look quite right and they walked up to them, can we help you? Okay, you stay here. We'll feed you until you get better, and then you can go back home. So what happened to Musa when he left Pharaoh? He went through the desert, came out the other side. He got looked after, but what did he do? He defended some people and went to work for their father. Became a good honourable shepherd. Yeah. So the issue with that is our elders didn't want to be in that space. They wanted them to actually move on. So in the painting that's at the State Library exhibition, there's a painting that an artist did of the actual signing of the treaty agreement on the banks of the Merry Creek. You have a look at that and you can see the eyes of various elders in the painting depicted, that you can see that they're looking at him with some anger. You can see that they're looking at him with some doubt. In fact, one guy that's standing just to his right has a boomerang and he's looking down at the other guy with Batman putting stuff on a sheet on the ground to show them what he was offering them. And that guy's looking at it like, yeah, what's that stuff? You have a look at the painting, you can read stuff in their eyes. It's amazing.
Thank you for sharing that, Uncle. And sister, if you could share with us your thoughts also.
I think what Uncle Andrew has said sums it up very beautifully. But I think with immigration, it's voluntary, basically. So families or individuals moving to a place. Colonization is state-sponsored settlement, and it's exploitation of land and resources. When a area is colonized, it reshapes the entire society and cultural practices of the indigenous populations. Immigration leads to multiculturalism, while the colonization basically is the imposition of the colonizer's culture. It is the colonizer's language. It is their religion. It is their food. It is their practices. So that's what the major difference is.
Actually, a good point you shared is about imposing their will on someone who's weak, basically, isn't
You
it?
guys still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. Don't worry.
Exactly. All our people were pushed on the missions in the 1860s. These were run by Moravian missionaries, yeah? State-sponsored though. But the clear issue was they had to get permission to do almost anything. There was an Aborigines Protection Board in place, and they had to get permission from them to even leave the mission. They had to get permission for them to marry. They had to leave the mission to actually go and get work, to get paid. As soon as they came back, the money was taken off them. So all this stuff about how
control. It's about absolute control, isn't it?
Control.
End of the day,
Absolutely.
it's like financial control is controlling where you can move. I mean, just look at the apartheid. It's basically apartheid, but back in the 1800s.
Australia had apartheid up until the 1960s here.
Mm.
There's not a lot of difference except for a wall, a fence between missions and the open air prisons of Gaza and the West Bank, right?
I did want to throw in there just an interesting fact when you mentioned Uncle Andrew, the Aboriginal, the protectorate. I actually have a letter, and I wish I'd taken it. I had the slide from my great-grandmother asking permission to get married to Neville Yeoman. You know, Neville, he's mentioned, he's in one of the characters in Rabbit Proof Fence.
Yes.
We have the letter and his permission and the signature.
Is it because she was marrying someone who was not Indigenous, or?
She was marrying my great-grandfather, who was from Balochistan. So yeah, I know a lot of the Cameliers are thought to come from Afghanistan, but they came from Balochistan, from India, the frontier, northwest frontier province, which is where Balochistan is, and Sindh, and also some were from Egypt and Turkey, which a lot of people don't know.
That I just found out about the Egypt and Turkey bit because I've always assumed they're from Afghanistan for some reason, you know. So um, with that being said, because at Muslim Votes Matter, it's all about educating, being aware. And if you had I'll start with you, sister. If there was one message you had for everyone before the coming 2025 federal elections, what's the one message which you want people to think about and how it can actually impact our futures? And not only for the indigenous people here, it's for what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Palestine, what's happening around the world, what happened to the, native Indians. Like, what's the one message you can give us? What's one thing we should consider when we're going to basically the elections that's coming around soon?
I think my main message, and you can see this happening all over the world, is the two-party system that they've got running in the US, in Canada, in the UK here. It's basically two sides of the same coin. So no matter which way you vote, the policies will be very similar. It's basically now almost a joke. So whoever becomes prime minister or those senior ministers, it's basically a job before you move on to your nice business CEO or paid board member position, of that kind of thing. So my message would be, we need to break the two-party system and look at people individually in the seats in the areas they represent, and whether their values align with ours. And my identity first, and I'm not ashamed ever to say that, is I'm a Muslim first before anything else. So I need to make sure that their values align with Islam and our values. And I think a lot of Australians would see, if you see the decline, the issues with gambling, with family violence, with those kinds of things. These are all common issues that affect everyone, not just Muslims. So my advice would be, don't vote for Labor or the Liberals, and vote for someone who represents our values.
Inshallah. Thank you for that, sister. And uncle, what would your message be to us?
Well, pretty much the same. The national shift to teal representation, either independence or almost green, is evident. And it's been shifting for the last two national elections. It's even evident in the state election as well. So those major parties are seeing the writing on the wall, where Muslims could actually all come together, no matter our ethnic differences. Muslims coming together and voting in a significant block for independence that, like the sister said, have a value alignment with Islam and our various aspirations of what we want to grow our communities to be, because we've been left out. We're always on the outer. As long as the whites are being looked after and they're safe and secure, they don't care about anybody else. In fact, they're okay about that, and because then they can actually go, oh, could we actually help you? Rather than, oh, we should have helped you in the first place. Yeah? Lift everybody up at the same time. So the statuses and there's been ongoing inconsistencies across the board. So yeah, our minority is becoming a bigger and bigger group as we collect together under a banner of Islam. The major parties will start, the governments will start to shake, because they'll be concerned that what's Islam? What are all these imams doing? What are all these committees of management of various organisations? What are they doing? I mean, I've got an ASIO file just for parking my car out the front of the mosque in Cairns. I used to live in Cairns. So I parked my car out the front on a Saturday morning. The sheikh rang me up and said, come down for breakfast. There's a bunch of brothers coming up from Brisbane. They're going to Guam. I went, oh, okay. So we went down that morning, parked there, had breakfast, said good day to them. We prayed. We made sure they got to the airport. Next thing I know, the cops are ringing me up saying we want to interview about a complaint we received. I was, what? What do you mean? What are you ringing me up for? What did I do? We've been informed that your car was parked at the front of this address. I went, yeah, that's the mosque. On what date? Oh, it was August, such and such a year. This was like 2002, right? I was like, my goodness. That was back then, everybody was watching what a Muslim was doing, yeah? If there was two Muslims standing together, they were almost known as a demonstration. And that's still evident in Queensland. If two Aboriginal people stood together in Musgrave Park, that'd be denoted as a demonstration under state law, and they'd be picked up and thrown in the clink for the weekend. Anyways, these are the kinds of things that we sort of need to consider. In the recent US election, there was a lot of Muslim women who voted against the mainstream. They were throwing their vote against the Democrats and the Republicans. They were putting them towards Green votes or independent votes. And so, pretty much it reduced the amount of effective votes that those two parties were getting. So, even over there, that there's a growing swell of, hang on, we're going to have to watch what they do. And you watch, they'll start bringing up 9/11 and all that sort of stuff again. What are they intending to do? But, if we always consistently do any rally or any demonstration in a non-violent way, then there's no record for them to come out with police batons and stuff, Have people watching like they do everybody else. But we shouldn't be picked on because we're Muslim. We should be able the freedom of choice about voting how we choose to. And if the major parties aren't doing it for us, then we need to select and we need to vote for somebody else. Other people that have got, like Doctor said, they've got the right value system that are going to, properly represent in policy how our communities can actually get a better outcome. How can our kids get a better opportunity at schools, education, how they can then get a better opportunity in terms of their working life and whatever career that they want to do? Where's the freedom to that? So these are definitely the things that we need to look at and consider. I know before the referendum last year, I was invited to a number of mosques to talk about what the referendum meant. I asked people to vote. I spoke to them about what the voice to Parliament meant. It was just merely providing advice to the government. Now, a lot of Aboriginal people think, well, why should we just be giving advice to them? We should be in a position where we're actually giving them this, but then practically putting it into practice. So what's the use of just giving advice when most likely they're just going to say no? So the no vote, although it already had a 6-month head start in terms of their campaign, they were very deceptive. I mean, I went to a polling booth in Violet Town, which is up near Shepparton, on the Saturday, and this pretty rough bushy walked up to me and gave me a little slip of paper, and it had on it 10 points why to vote no. And I looked at it and went, oh, okay. The first one was Aboriginal people don't pay tax. And I thought, wow, I've been paying tax for 40 years. Can I have my money back, please?
Same.
There was a bunch of other things which I got offended about, but these are the things that you confront. Like, how's that relevant? What are you even pulling that out? They're not even relevant to anything, to the voices providing, just advice to the government. Oh, no, why do you have to have it in the Constitution for? Because then it can't just be written out, as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was done in 2004. It provided advice, but also it provided policy advice, but also was allocated a certain amount of money to do a lot of community infrastructure programs around Australia. And because they started saying no to the government's policy views, the government, the Howard government chose to defund them and get rid of them. And that was the threat. If you have a voice that isn't in the Constitution, because see how difficult it was to actually get it into the Constitution. It'd be doubly different for the government to actually get rid of it out of the Constitution. There's been nothing that's ever been taken out of the Constitution, only added. Yeah. So I'm getting a bit sort of technical now, but at the end of the day,
Yes, it's important you're sharing that, Uncle, because at the end of the day, basically, the definition of madness is doing the same thing again and again and expecting something different. And I think, I've always been apolitical. I've never been political. Earn, work hard, look after my family, but now I've got to think about the future generations, right? So I was actually wondering how we're going to be speaking for an hour. We're actually 4 minutes over
absolutely.
time, Uncle. So alhamdulillah,
Yeah, okay. Okay.
but Jazakallah khair for both your times. I really appreciate it. That too on a Monday, and the knowledge shared. And let's hope, this is a movement, like politically agnostic, if that's something you can say, where people who are not politically in tune at all, we're coming together because and we're actually reaching out to each other because it's the bonds of friendship, but it's also justice, isn't it? We
Oh,
want one
absolutely.
rule. We want one rule for everybody. So
Yeah.
my co-host Hanif and Imrul are going to share links in the chat. So there'll be a link where you can provide us with some feedback. There'll be a SurveyMonkey link, and also there'll be a link for you to join our WhatsApp group. And basically, you'll see all our socials also being put in the chat. But with that being said, Brother Imrul, is there anything you would like to say before closing?
Jazakallah khair, everyone, for listening in, and our two hosts. What you've said is been very insightful, and I do reflect on some of the trauma that the people here have gone through, and I do have a new level of appreciation for the blessings that we've all received, and it's always important to, inshallah, sort of never forget others in our prayer, and whether they're sort of here in Australia living a very difficult life, or in other countries, including sort of Palestine and Lebanon and Syria. So inshallah, please remember them in your du'as.
Inshallah. And with that being said, uncle and sister, Jazakallah khair for your time. And I hope we get to meet in person and discuss this more, because I feel like it's only a drop in the ocean what has been shared today. So with that being said, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. And we'll end this webinar. Thank you.